Early in the morning on February 5th, 1990, 57-year-old Laverne Pavlinok stood in the kitchen of her Wilsonville, Oregon apartment making some coffee. Mornings were the best part of Laverne's day because she had the whole apartment to herself. Now, she lived with her boyfriend, John Sosnovsky, but he worked at a nearby mill and had to be out early in order to catch the bus there. And each time he left, Laverne felt like a huge weight lifted off of her. Because when John wasn't home, Laverne could go about her day and pretend she was safe. But that's all it was pretend. John, in reality, was an incredibly violent man. I mean, he was seriously physically abusive, especially when he was drunk, which was basically all the time. So Laverne had actually been married, but her husband had died of cancer, and she had ultimately met John following her husband's death. And so when they met, Laverne was very vulnerable and lonely, and she really hadn't realized the kind of person John was until it was too late. It had been 10 years now, and Laverne still had not, built up the courage to leave him. I mean, the reality was she was just scared of how he would react, and so she sort of felt trapped. Now, she sat down at her kitchen table with her coffee, and she opened up the local paper. And as soon as she did, the first thing she saw was a big black and white photo of a smiling young woman who likely was in her 20s. The photo was connected to an article about a recent murder that happened 30 miles away, just northeast of Portland. The victim had been identified as a woman named Tanya Bennett, and Tanya Bennett was the girl in the photo. The article said she had been beaten and then also strangled with a rope, and then she had been left on the side of the highway. And when Laverne read about the area she actually had been, dumped, she realized it actually was only about 1.5 miles down from this famous scenic overlook that Laverne had actually been to before. Like, she was familiar with this area. And so Laverne, she's reading the article and she's looking at this picture back and forth, and it was like something was sort of forming in her mind. She just had like this weird sense that she knew something about this case. And then as she stared at this photo for a little bit longer, it's like it all came together. And she realized almost certainly that she knew John very likely killed this woman. And so even though she loved her peaceful, quiet mornings with her coffee, Laverne immediately stood up, she grabbed the phone, and she called the police. After she hung up with police, Laverne was very shaken up. I mean, her heart was still racing. I mean, this was a very risky thing she was doing because she had no way of knowing if what she had just given authorities was enough to arrest John. If it wasn't, it was entirely possible that John would discover this betrayal of her calling the police about him, implicating him in a murder, and he would probably just continue his abuse, if not amp up his abuse of Laverne. And so the way she saw it is either what she just did was going to end the chapter with John and he was going to go to jail for murder, or Laverne might wind up being the next dead girl on the side of the highway. A little over a week later, on the morning of February 16th, Detective John Ingram sat with his partner in a very clean living room in Wilsonville, Oregon. Ingram was the lead investigator on Tanya Bennett's murder case, and he was there to speak to Laverne, who was sitting on the opposite couch. And Laverne seemed really nervous and kept fidgeting constantly and offering Ingram and his partner refreshments. It was just very clear that there was a lot on this woman's mind. So Ingram knew that Laverne had a week earlier called in a tip about the victim's killer. She thought it was her own boyfriend, John Sosnovsky. And right now, Ingram was very eager to hear what she had to say about her boyfriend, to basically elaborate and sort of give the full story of why she believed what she believed, in part because Ingram's case so far had absolutely no other leads. Like, this was it. The victim's body had been found on a grassy slope so close to the edge of the highway that you could see her from the road. But Ingram and his partner had not been able to find any witnesses. A few people had claimed to have seen Tanya along with some man at a bar earlier in the night before she went missing, but no one had been able to effectively describe that man. It was just some guy she was with. And so Ingram and his partner had basically talked to just about anyone they could think of that might have known Tanya. They'd canvassed her neighborhood, they'd interviewed her family, coworkers, friends, and they still had not been able to find anybody who fit as a suspect. They also hadn't found any good physical evidence at the scene, like fingerprints or helpful forensics. So now, Ingram was hoping that Laverne was going to be the key to his whole case. And so eventually, Ingram looked at Laverne and said, "Whenever you're ready, tell me what you know. Tell me the story of why you believe John killed Tanya. Now, at first, Laverne just continued to squirm in her seat, and she was, obviously very nervous, but eventually, after Ingram told her to just, take a breath, calm down, it's okay, we just want to hear your story, eventually, with a shaking voice, she told them that on the night of the murder, John had come home around maybe 1 or 2 in the morning and immediately got in the shower. Now, this was unusual. I mean, this is not something that he typically did. He didn't shower at 2 in the morning. But Laverne really hadn't thought much of it until the next day when they went to a local bar, and she'd literally overheard John bragging to somebody about murdering Tanya, describing how he had picked her up at a truck stop, killed her, then took her to the highway by Columbia River Gorge to dump her body by this scenic overlook. As Laverne spoke, Ingram and his partner were shocked. Basically, Laverne had overheard effectively a confession, and the details of that confession did seem to line up with what they had heard so far. Tanya had been seen out late at night with some man, although nobody could really describe the man. And also where her body was found, it was near the scenic overlook, something that was, publicly known, but still, that's what Laverne heard John say. It lined up. But he kept a poker face and just told Laverne to please keep going, keep elaborating. And so Laverne, she continued speaking, and she went on to say that the reason she didn't come forward right away was because she was scared of John. He was a violent alcoholic who abused her, which is also part of the reason why this seemed real to her. She was totally not shocked at the idea that maybe John killed someone, but she was basically fearful that he might kill her too. And so she had kept it to herself until she had seen the article in the paper and also saw the picture of the girl, and she just looked so young and innocent, and she just couldn't help but feel like she owed it to that girl to come forward. Now, at this point, Ingram's mind was whirling. If this was all true, it was huge for this case. Potentially, this just solved the whole murder. This is what happened potentially. But he also knew, right now, it was just one woman's story. He needed actual proof. He couldn't just take Laverne's word for it. So he asked Laverne if he and his partner could just go ahead and search the apartment. And as soon as Laverne nodded, the detectives jumped to their feet and got to work. Laverne led the detectives down the hallway to the master bedroom, and then from there, she backed off and just, let the men get to work. And the detectives, they immediately split up and spread out to cover more ground. Ingram had actually brought along a list of stuff that they were theoretically looking for. And one of the things on his list was a swatch of denim from the front buttons of Tanya's jeans. It had been missing when they found her, like it had been intentionally cut out, which was obviously pretty unusual. And it made him think that Tanya's killer had taken a trophy or something. But after a few minutes of searching around the bedroom, Ingram did not see this denim patch. In fact, he actually didn't see anything at first glance that connected John to Tanya. Until he went over to look through this cardboard box of papers and began sifting through them. And when he pulled out a torn piece of scrap paper and read what was on it, he froze. On this piece of scrap paper was a handwritten message that just said, quote, "T. Bennett, good peace." Ingram immediately called his partner over, who walked over and looked at the note, and both of them are like, okay, obviously, we need to bring John in right away for a chat. But after leaving the bedroom and walking towards the door to leave, who comes in the front door? None other than John Sosnowski. About an hour later, Ingram sat at an interrogation table in the sheriff's office, staring across it at John. And John had a very confused look on his face, but otherwise seemed relatively calm. Back at the apartment, when John had walked in the door and sort of saw the detectives and didn't know what was going on, Ingram had told him who he was and why he was there. And John had really just seemed surprised, but had quickly agreed to go with them to the station if they wanted to speak to him. But Ingram knew from experience that, just because John was acting very cooperative did not mean he was innocent. Now, Ingram slid a picture of Tanya across the table and asked John if he knew who she was or had anything to do with her murder. And John didn't deny it or act horrified or offended to be asked. He just said he didn't really remember. And when Ingram showed him the note they found in his bedroom that said T. Bennett, good peace on it, John just sort of squinted at it and said he really wasn't sure if he wrote that or not. So these were all very straightforward questions, and it was highly suspicious to Ingram that John apparently just couldn't answer them, at least not cleanly. And really the rest of his interview went the same way, with John giving mostly just vague non-answers to everything Ingram asked, no matter how binary the question was supposed to be. And Ingram was just sort of struck by how nonchalant John seemed whenever he responded, even though, he was being questioned about his connection to a murder. This was not a time to be nonchalant. This was a time to be forthcoming. However, despite Ingram's very high suspicion of John, realistically, the only evidence he had on John, at least at this point, was all circumstantial, and so was not nearly enough to actually arrest John. What they needed in order to do that was some form of hard evidence that directly connected him to Tanya's murder. So ultimately, at the end of this interview, despite how weird the whole thing had been, Ingram just sighed and told John that for now, he could go. 4 days later, Ingram had just gotten to his office for the morning when his desk phone rang. He picked up and was surprised to hear Laverne's voice on the other end. But before he could ask her what this was about, Laverne told him she had found something in her car that morning and felt like he needed to see it. And when she told him what this thing was, Ingram said he would be right over. Then he immediately hung up and ran to find his partner. As he drove to Laverne's, he found his heart was racing. Over the last few days, they hadn't found any additional evidence to prove John was their killer. In fact, if anything, they had actually lost some evidence, since that note they found inside of John's things in his house ended up being a dead end, because their analysts couldn't actually match the handwriting to John, so they didn't know for sure if it was him. But now, based on what Laverne had just told him on the phone about what she found in her car, he was pretty much positive that this was the break he needed. Within the hour, Ingram and his partner were standing in Laverne's garage with Laverne staring into the open trunk of her car. Laverne had told Ingram that she kept her car and really her whole life very, very clean, like her apartment's clean, everything's clean all the time. And when she went into her car that day, she noticed there was a little swatch of denim sitting in the trunk. And she knew that she had not put it there, and considering she was sort of on high alert about John and about his connection to this murder, it just seemed like something worth flagging to police. And for Ingram and his partner, as they're staring into the trunk at this little swatch of denim that looks very much like the swatch of denim they were secretly looking for, they had not publicly revealed that the killer had taken a little swatch of denim from Tanya's jeans that was private. They're looking at this thinking, oh my goodness, this is the break we needed. Clearly, that's the denim from Tanya's jeans. And so Laverne was right to call this in. This is potentially huge. Now, obviously, Ingram knew that they would still have to get this denim tested to make sure it really was Tanya's. It's entirely possible that it was actually Laverne's or John's or was unrelated, but circumstantially, this felt like hitting the jackpot. And so Ingram watched as his partner picked up the swatch, put it into an evidence bag, and then they left and said they would have it tested and they would be in touch. The following morning, Ingram was at his desk reviewing all the evidence that they had so far. And by this point, they had a lot of evidence. The previous night, after finding the denim, they had brought John in for a polygraph test, and he had completely failed it. The test administrator had even noted that, in his opinion, John definitely knew what had happened to Tanya. So now, realistically, Ingram was just sort of waiting on confirmation that that fabric was a match. And then at that point, they could go and arrest John. And when Ingram's phone rang, he picked it up immediately, and it was the lab. And so Ingram sat up straight, ready for some good news. But the tech on the other line sounded sort of glum, and he told Ingram that the denim from Laverne's car did not match the jeans that Tanya was wearing, so it was not hers. And at this, Ingram was just completely stunned. The idea that they had just found the same unique cut of denim in a car in their main suspect's house could not be a coincidence. It was not typical for people to have little swatches of denim lying around. This is not something that you just happen to have. It felt sort of specific. And so there just had to be more to this than met the eye. And even though Ingram tried to work out some kind of reasonable explanation for why that swatch was there, the only thing that actually made sense was that the fake denim was planted there. And so feeling a mix of, again, shock, but also just frustration here. He thought he was so close to solving this thing, and now he was sort of back to square one. Ingram realized that the next stop had to be Laverne's. He needed to go speak to her again. Later that morning, Ingram and his partner were once again back in Laverne's living room with a very nervous-looking Laverne sitting across from them. This time, Ingram was going to be a little tougher on her. because he now knew that, whatever she had told him before very likely was not the full story. And as soon as Ingram asked Laverne point blank if she had planted that evidence, that denim inside of her car, Laverne just kind of looked back at him and her face began to sort of quiver, and then she just started sobbing. And she told them she was so sorry. She explained that she had cut up some jeans and put that front button part in her car and pretended to have found it so that they'd be able to arrest John. She said she had just gotten so worried when they let him go after interviewing him because she knew John killed Tanya. He had to have. She heard him talk about it. Like, he did it and he's dangerous. And she just wanted to make sure the police held him accountable. Now, when Ingram heard this, he could hear the earnestness in her voice. Like, clearly this woman is scared of John and thinks he did this. She believes he did this. And so he wanted to believe her angle here, as inappropriate as planting evidence was. But, critically, he knew Laverne still was definitely not telling him everything, because there was simply no way she could have known to plant that unique cut of the jeans unless she had intimate knowledge of the crime or some other inside information. But there was just something missing here. Why would she randomly choose that front cut of denim as just the evidence? Oh, here's some evidence that's going to make John look guilty. Why would she choose that? That's way too on the nose. And when he pointed this out to Laverne, it was like Laverne's energy completely shifted, from sobbing and sadness and remorse to just pure hesitation. Like, she didn't really know how to react, but there wasn't any more sadness. It was like, uh-oh, something's off here. And then Laverne kind of took a deep breath and she looked at Ingram and she said, I was lying. You're right. My story about planting the evidence, that was a lie. But she went on to say that the reason she had lied was because she had ultimately been too afraid that if the police knew the whole story, that she would get in trouble too. Then Laverne explained what really happened to Tanya. On the night that Tanya was murdered, Laverne said John called her that night and he was sort of frantic. And he said to her that he was in trouble and that she needed to meet him at the bar that he was at and to bring along a shower curtain. And so Laverne said, because she was very scared of John and was just fearful of asking any questions, she had just done what he said. And she got the shower curtain and she had driven out there and she found John in a parking lot standing over a body. It was Tanya. And she was just lying there on the ground, motionless. Laverne said she was horrified and didn't know what to do, so she just helped. She literally helped John put Tanya's body into her car, Laverne's car, wrapped her up in that curtain she'd brought along, and then together they dumped her body at a spot along the highway. But as Laverne continued to talk, her story suddenly got much darker because she actually eventually confessed that Tanya had not been dead when she had first arrived, but instead she was still clinging to life. And at John's request, Laverne had tied rope around Tanya's neck and held it tight while John sexually assaulted her. Laverne said after he was done, Tanya was no longer breathing. Ingram could barely conceal his shock when she explained this. I mean, here was this gentle, soft-spoken lady who was now telling him that she had actively participated in the sexual assault and murder of this young woman. It was hard to wrap his head around it. And at the moment, all Ingram could think was, this can't be real. But what Laverne was saying just fit. It explained John's cagey answers to his questions, his failed polygraph, and how Laverne knew the right part of the jeans to cut out and fake his evidence, because she and John had been the ones who actually made the cut on Tanya's jeans. They knew. But despite getting this earth-shattering confession here, Ingram wanted to be completely sure that this version of the story Laverne was telling him was actually the truth, and he knew exactly how to prove it. The following day, Ingram was behind the wheel of his cruiser next to his partner, and Laverne sat in the back, sort of absent-mindedly staring out the window. They were driving down the highway northeast of Portland, and Ingram had instructed Laverne to let him know when they reached the spot where they dumped Tanya's body. Now, the newspapers had published the general location of where the body had been found, but certainly not specifics. So Ingram knew that if Laverne could point out the exact spot, well, that meant she was telling the truth. As they began to get closer and closer to the spot Ingram knew was the spot. He sort of felt his heart rate pick up, but he didn't drive any faster or slower. He didn't signal that it was coming up. He just kept on driving, steady, going straight, sort of expecting Laverne to call it out any moment. But the cruiser drove right past the actual spot where the body had been found, and Laverne didn't say anything. For a few minutes, they just kept on driving down the road in total silence, and Ingram's feeling really disappointed here. And as they're driving along, suddenly Laverne says, "Hey, wait a minute, turn around." So Ingram did, and soon they were headed back the way they'd come. And this time, when they passed the actual crime scene, so the actual spot where Tanya had been found, Laverne called it out and said that's where she was. Stop. As Ingram parked the car, he looked back at Laverne, who was staring intently out the window, right at the exact spot on that slope right off the highway where the body had been found. Then, once they were parked, all three of them got out of the car, and Laverne went over to the edge of the road and pointed, like right to the exact spot where Tanya had been found on this slope. And even though Ingram tried to keep his expression neutral here, internally he was sort of amazed. I mean, clearly Laverne was telling the truth. It would have been impossible for her to have chosen that specific spot without having prior knowledge of where Tanya had been, meaning she was telling the truth. She must have been involved in killing Tanya. As they all climbed back into the car, Ingram knew they now had more than enough to formally arrest John and also Laverne. She'd done the right thing by coming forward, but of course now there were going to be consequences. On February 21st, so 16 days after Laverne called with her first tip, John Sosnovsky was arrested. And 5 days after that, Laverne was arrested as well, and both of them were charged with murder. About 11 months later, Laverne's trial started, and at that point, Laverne actually tried to change her story again. She tried to recant her confession and said, "No, I didn't actually do this." But the jury didn't buy her change of heart and convicted her of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. As for John, 2 months after Laverne's sentencing, he was given the same sentence, life in prison. And that should have been the end of the case, at least from the legal perspective. But for the next 3 years following sentencing, Ingram just couldn't stop thinking about Laverne and John and Tanya Bennett. Despite what Laverne had done, he felt a lot of empathy for her. She'd obviously been under John's control and had seemed genuinely terrified of him. But more than that, Ingram had this horrible, nagging feeling that they'd gotten something wrong here. Then, one March afternoon in 1994, Ingram was in his office at the sheriff's department going over some paperwork when his desk phone rang. When he picked it up, it was the prosecutor who'd worked Tanya's case. And the prosecutor said they'd just gotten a very strange letter about Tanya's murder. And as soon as the prosecutor described the letter's contents, Ingram felt sick to his stomach. Ingram had been right to worry that he and his partner and really the whole legal system had potentially just gotten something wrong with this case. It just felt like there was something left unsaid. There was some loophole, there was some loose end something, but he didn't know what it was. It would turn out the thing that was wrong was Laverne, because their star witness, Laverne, was not just this sweet older lady afraid of her abusive boyfriend who had come forward and told the truth despite the consequences. That wasn't really the story. In fact, basically everything she told Ingram and his partner was a lie. What was true, and what ultimately drove Laverne to do what she did, was she really wanted to break up with John, but she didn't know how to do it. And so what she ultimately did to attempt to rid herself of John was to frame him for murder. And at first, she did an incredible job. She read everything she could, little details about the murder in the news. She also snuck a peek at Ingram's list of evidence during that early interview that was done at her apartment, and so that's how she knew about, that swatch of denim they were looking for. And she also just happened to take a few really lucky guesses, like when she pointed out the spot on the side of the highway where the body was found, she just guessed, but it happened to be right. However, the problem was, despite, basically nailing the framing of John and getting him wrapped up with a murder conviction, she also sort of inadvertently implicated herself. When she came out and said, "Well, I participated in the murder," her thinking was, they'll take pity on me and they'll blame John, he'll go to jail and I'll be okay. But no, she also got convicted of murder and went to jail as well. And Laverne and John were literally in prison, basically riding out their life sentences, when the actual killer, the real Tanya Bennett killer, sent a letter to authorities confessing to his crime. That was why that prosecutor called Ingram. It was to tell him, I think there's been a mistake. They clearly didn't do it. After the real killer was arrested in 1995, Laverne and John were both released from prison. In total, they both served 4 years in jail, all because of Laverne's lies. Our second and final story is called The Intruder. One morning in early November of 2023, a 71-year-old woman named Patrice Miller stood in front of her fridge in her little home in the rural town of Downeyville, California, and she saw she was running low on food, which meant it was time to place an order with the market in town, which delivered her groceries for her. Getting her food delivered was essential for Patrice and where she was at in her life right now. She lived alone and had a whole house to take care of, which was definitely getting harder the older she got. She'd also had some health problems lately, so it was getting more difficult just to move around. She even had a walking stick just to prop herself up. As Patrice stood in front of her fridge, wondering what she was going to add to her grocery list, she heard one of her 2 cats meowing outside, and this reminded her that amongst some other chores, she needed to feed her cats. So she decided to make her list later, and she just closed the fridge door, put some cat food in a bowl, and then grabbed her walking stick and headed outside. Patrice carried the cat food out onto the porch. She had some other things to do outside, but she couldn't hold a lot of things at once because of her walking stick. So once she had put the bowl down, she then headed back inside to get her compost, and then took that back outside to her garden. And she tried to do all these outdoor chores really quickly because she didn't like being outside these days. She had lived in Downeyville for a long time, but over the past few years, it had gotten really dangerous there. Now, she hadn't realized how bad it was at first because she mostly kept to herself, but eventually she learned that her neighbors were starting to get intruders on their property. There had also been a clear uptick in vandalism in people's yards and to their homes. And in fact, over the past few months, Patrice herself had begun to experience this directly. In fact, she had dealt with so many attempted break-ins at her own house that she had become convinced that she had a stalker. She'd even put bars on her windows as a security measure. So that's why Patrice did not like being outside. She felt exposed, like her stalker or whoever it was that was doing this was going to be watching her and would come over here and attack. And so as fast as she could, she dumped the compost in her garden, turned around, hustled inside, and shut the door behind her. And as soon as she had done that and was safely inside her house, she felt hugely relieved. A few days later, on November 8th, at the market in town where Patrice typically got her groceries, a 55-year-old cashier named Cassie Koch rang up a customer at the register. But as she bagged their purchases, her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Patrice. Cassie was typically the person that delivered Patrice's grocery order, but over the years, they had become closer than just a customer-provider relationship. They were friends. In fact, these days, the two of them would speak on the phone fairly often, just to chat. But now, Cassie realized she hadn't heard from Patrice in days, which was very odd, both because of their friendship, but also because she knew it had been a while since Patrice made her grocery order. And so Cassie had begun asking around at the store and had found out that nobody else had heard from Patrice either. Now, Cassie knew it was possible that Patrice was just busy, and for pretty much anybody else, one missed order or even a couple missed orders wouldn't be enough to make Cassie worry. But in this case, Cassie was extra concerned because she knew about Patrice's stalker. And she knew that Patrice had even called the authorities about it, but they really hadn't been much help. Remember, this is a tiny rural town in California that had experienced a lot of exactly what Patrice was experiencing: break-ins, harassment, and other kinds of vandalism or damage. However, neither Patrice nor anybody else had reported any actual violence. So authorities were basically overwhelmed with a flood of what they considered sort of relatively minor complaints. And Patrice's situation really didn't seem much worse than anybody else's in town. And also officials just didn't have the manpower to deal with it. And so ultimately, all authorities did was just advise Patrice on ways she could handle it herself, which was why she'd installed those bars on her windows. All this is to say, Cassie knew that Patrice was genuinely terrified of her stalker, who Patrice referred to as Big Bastard. And she was worried about what the stalker might do next. So, after Cassie was done with her shift that day, she tried to get in touch with Patrice one more time. But when she couldn't reach her yet again, Cassie called the police and asked them to go do a wellness check. That evening, a deputy from the Sierra County Sheriff's Department drove up to Patrice's house and parked in front. And immediately, he could tell something was wrong. The front door of her house was clearly smashed in, and there was a garden hose that was laying across her porch steps and was spraying water everywhere, like the water had just been left on. And so the deputy got out of his cruiser and he walked over to the house and he found the turnoff for the water on the side of the house. And then he walked up the front steps of the porch. And as he did this, he was constantly looking around and listening, trying to figure out what was going on here. I mean, he didn't know if there was an active threat inside the house. He had no idea what he was walking into. And so he's on the porch, and before going in through the front door, which was obviously, smashed open, he looked in a window to see if he could see into the house to gauge what was going on here. And when he looked inside the house, the first thing he saw was blood all over the floor. And at that point, he unholstered his gun. And so now, with his gun raised, the deputy stepped into the house. And he slowly walked through the living room, listening for any signs of sudden movement or an indication there was someone still in the house, but he didn't hear anything. And so there didn't appear to be an intruder present right now, but there was also no sign of Patrice. All he saw was that blood towards the front of the house. That was it. And so the deputy, he left the living room and walked towards the kitchen. And as soon as he stepped across the threshold into the kitchen, he breathed in and just kind of held his breath because what he saw was just chaos. All the cabinets were open, and all over the floor were remnants of all the food that likely was in the cabinets, like pieces of food and ripped up packaging and broken jars. A window at the far end of the room was also smashed, and the security bars that Patrice had put on the window were bent and hanging by their hinges. There was actually so much just debris and just chaos in the kitchen that at first, the deputy didn't register what was actually laying in the center of the kitchen on the floor. But then, when his brain sort of processed it, he realized what he was looking at was Patrice. At least, what was left of her. But she no longer looked human, because her body had literally been torn apart. The deputy quickly left the house and called in his terrible discovery to the sheriff. And within an hour, Patrice's property was swarming with police and crime scene techs and a forensic expert who specialized in this type of scene, and detectives fanned out all across the area and began speaking to Patrice's neighbors. And because pretty much everyone in the neighborhood had been experiencing the same type of break-ins and property damage that Patrice had been, it actually didn't take long for police to develop a profile of Patrice's killer. Their conclusion was that very likely the killer was the same individual who was harassing everybody else. But what officials couldn't understand is why had everybody else experienced effectively minor vandalism, but Patrice went from minor vandalism to really excessive violence. And this required developing a profile of Patrice. And so as police searched for her killer, they were also working on reconstructing Patrice's movements on the final day of her life. And at first, in their efforts, really they were just stumped. I mean, all she had done on that day, as far as they could tell, were some basic chores. But as they dug into what those chores consisted of, they found two things that actually explained everything. It would turn out that every day for the past couple of years, Patrice had been making two terrible mistakes. She fed her cats out on the porch, and she emptied her compost into the garden. And these two actions ultimately were what sort of attracted her stalker, Big Bastard, to her home. Because Big Bastard was a black bear. He loved to eat cat food and kitchen compost scraps. And eventually, he decided that Patrice was food too. So on that day in early November of 2023, when Patrice fed her cats and emptied her compost for the last time, Big Bastard waited until Patrice was in bed and then broke into her house and savagely killed her. By the time the deputy arrived at Patrice's home, Big Bastard had been eating Patrice's body for days. And so what he saw in the kitchen was what was left of her. Black bears are not typically dangerous to people. In fact, Patrice was the first known black bear fatality in California history. But it was exactly that sort of lack of perceived danger, which is why officials didn't help Patrice or any of our other neighbors get rid of these black bears when they were coming into their neighborhood and causing all this property damage and all this alarm. They basically said, what's the worst they could do? On the afternoon of October 11th, 2016, a middle-aged man named Carlos Herrera Sr. entered the visitation area of a prison in Venezuela. The room itself sort of looked like a high school cafeteria, with tables and chairs everywhere for the inmates and their visitors to sit down and have their meetings. And right in front of one was one table where there was this bedraggled-looking prisoner who he was there to meet. As Juan got closer to this guy, he could see he really looked terrible, the inmate. I mean, his cheekbones were sticking out, he was sort of emaciated, he was bloodied and bruised, he had bandages on his arm. And also, as Juan moved towards this guy, he could clearly see all the guards that lined the walls and the exits of this visitation area sort of squirm with discomfort, as this meeting is about to take place. And Juan had a good idea why these guards might be anxious. And that's because over the past month, this prison had been on lockdown because a gang inside the prison had risen up and overpowered the guards and completely taken over for this entire month. And just to be clear, during this month, people died as a result of this takeover. This was a horrible month for this prison, and it was only over the past couple of days that the guards were finally able to take back control. And Juan knew all this, not only because this riot was all over the news while it was going on, but also because his own son, Juan Jr., was serving time in this prison for robbery. He had been for the past year. However, Juan Sr. was not coming to visit his son right now. Instead, he was coming to visit a different prisoner, because during this riot, Juan Jr. had just disappeared. And Juan Sr., when he had found out about that, had called prison officials, other people, politicians, you name it, to try to figure out where his son went, but nobody seemed to know. And so finally, he had found this one prisoner, the guy he was meeting today, this beaten down looking guy, who had agreed to come forward and tell Juan Sr. what he knew about what happened to Juan Jr. And so Juan sat down at this table with this prisoner, and after the two of them introduced themselves, very quickly, Juan Sr. said, please, tell me what happened to my son, where is he? But this prisoner he was talking to didn't immediately get into sort of a clear story about Juan Jr. This guy began talking about a totally separate prisoner, a man named Dorangel Vargas. Vargas was notorious across Venezuela for a series of brutal murders he committed that ultimately put him in this prison. And during this recent riot at this prison, it was Vargas and his gang that rose up and took over. Vargas was in charge, effectively, of the riot. And so even though he was terrorizing people and brutalizing people and was very much responsible for the deaths of multiple inmates, he also at the same time did have to make sure that, the people he was in charge of, albeit illegally, had enough food, they had enough supplies, that they had the things they needed to survive. And so again, he's sort of dictatorial and awful, but also, ensuring people have basic resources. And so Juan Sr. is listening to this man sort of lay this out about Vargas and sort of how he was in control during this riot. And Juan Sr. is like, I just don't get it. Why are you explaining the nuances of what he was doing during the riot? And this prisoner very quickly pointed to the bandage on his arm and kind of pointed at all of his injuries that were very obvious. And he told Juan Sr. that if anybody got in the way of Vargas while he was in charge during this riot, they were basically beaten to within an inch of their lives, and again, in some cases, people were killed. This was a brutal regime. And so Juan Sr. is like, oh my goodness, is that what happened to my son? Was he beaten like you by Vargas? But at that point, the prisoner just shook his head and said no, and then he looked down and almost couldn't make eye contact with Juan Sr., and he just said, what happened to your son was much worse. The prisoner would tell Juan Sr. that at some point during the riot, his son, Juan Jr., was tapped by Vargas to help with something. Now, it's not clear if Jr. went willingly or he was coerced, but we know that basically everybody had to do what Vargas asked them to do, otherwise they would be beaten or even killed. And so ultimately, Jr. agrees to help Vargas. And the thing he was tapped to help Vargas with was distributing food to the inmates. Because remember, despite how brutal Vargas was, he was in charge of providing basic necessities to all the inmates. And because of this riot, the prison had been locked down, and so food supplies had been restricted. And so inmates are beginning to starve, there's this big food shortage, and so Jr. was told, hey, you need to help us provide food to these inmates. So Jr. basically agreed to do it, at which point he was informed exactly what role he was playing in finding food. Instead of going out and looking for this food, Junior was the food. Vargas and his gang cornered Junior, beat him to death, butchered his body, and then literally fed him to the inmates. That's what happened to Juan's son. After hearing this horrific story, Juan Sr. was destroyed. And one of the first things he did is he went public and had this big press conference to tell the world about what happened to his son. But despite there being many eyewitness accounts, ultimately, the Venezuelan government denied the cannibalism and nobody was ever held accountable. Durangel Vargas remains incarcerated and he's never been charged with any crimes connected to Junior's disappearance. Our next story is called Falling Treasure. On the evening of July 2nd, 1993, a 49-year-old politician named Mrballen Idris paced around the living room inside of his home, which was located in a suburb of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Mrballen was feeling very anxious because tonight, in his home, he was going to have a very important meeting. So Mrballen was already a very successful politician. He was a state assemblyman, which is sort of like a state congressperson. But what he really coveted, the thing he wanted more than anything else in his political career, was to become the state's Menteri Besar, which is sort of like being the state's governor. But to get this role, Mrballen had to be appointed. And realistically, he didn't know if that was going to happen. And that was in part because recently he had felt like his political power was sort of, slipping away from him. And on top of that, he was getting older and he sort of felt like his popularity was waning too. And so he felt like, in order for me to get appointed to become the state's Menteri Besar, I really need to find a unique way to reclaim that political power and popularity. And that was going to be the central focus of the big meeting at his house that night. And so Mrballen continued to pace around, anxiously checking his watch, waiting for these people to show up. And then sure enough, late that night, he heard a knock on the door. He hustled over to the door and he made sure he looked okay. And then he opened it up. And standing in the hallway is this unbelievably beautiful woman who's flanked by these two men that he didn't know. And immediately, Mrballen is just completely drawn to this woman. She had long dark hair, this huge smile, and her eyes, they sucked him in. It was like she was, hypnotizing him or something. She really looked like a celebrity, at least as Mrballen imagined celebrities look up close. This woman's name was Mona Fandi. And actually, to some degree, she was a celebrity. Back in the 1980s, she had released a pop music album that had been very popular all over Malaysia, and so she was kind of famous in Malaysia. Now, in the early 1990s, Mona was done singing, that part of her life was over, but she had launched this brand new second career post-music that, to some people, it seemed like that actually made her more notable and more famous than her singing had. These days, Mona was a highly sought-after professional shaman. So in Malaysia at this time, shamanism was pretty popular and mainstream. Shamans were these people who claimed to have supernatural powers, they could heal people and bring them prosperity. And so it wasn't uncommon for the really well-known shamans to be called upon by very powerful people, like, politicians, let's say, to sort of leverage their powers to increase their clout and their influence. And so Mrballen saw Mona, who at the time was arguably the most famous shaman in the entire country. He saw her as his meal ticket. She was going to be the way that he reclaimed the power he needed so he could be appointed as the state's Menteri Besar. And so Mrballen very excitedly welcomed Mona and the two men who were her husband and her assistant into his home. And, even though Mrballen had expected to see Mona tonight, he knew she was the one who'd be performing this ritual tonight, he still couldn't help but feel totally starstruck by her. And so as a result, he had a lot of nervous energy and he began sort of rapid firing, asking her questions about, how quickly will I see results and how's this gonna go? And, how successful are these things really? And Mona, as she's just looking at him and smiling, she just eventually reaches out as he's talking and just puts her hand on his shoulder and says, "It's okay. Why don't you show my husband and my assistant where the room is, where the space is that we're gonna be doing this ritual tonight?" And at this, Mrballen just totally shut up and he nodded. He sort of got the hint that he was sort of being too much here. And he led them into this other room that he had cleared out for tonight. There was nothing on the ground. It was like a vacant room in his house. And right away, the assistant, he began spreading flower petals all over the ground, while Mrballen began speaking to Mona's husband to work out payment details. I mean, this was not a free thing that he was getting. It was going to cost him the equivalent of tens of thousands of US dollars to get what he wanted here, to gain his power back. But Mrballen didn't really care about how much this cost in money, because to him, it was absolutely worth it. And so once the payment details were handled, and Mrballen was, ready, and the assistant had finished putting all the flower petals out, Mona walked over and told Mrballen to come with her. And so he followed Mona, and they went into the ritual room that again is covered with flower petals, and she told Mrballen to lay down on his back in the middle of the room. So he did that, he laid down, and he's looking up at Mona, and her assistant and her husband are off in the background, and Mona's got that big, dazzling smile, and she's staring right at him. She says, "Close your eyes and clear your mind. And all I want you to do is just focus on your desires for the future. What riches do you want to come to you? And focus solely on those." And so Mrballen did this. In his mind's eye, he pictured himself becoming more politically powerful and more popular and landing the job of his dreams. And he's sort of narrating what he's saying out loud. And Mona's telling him, good, keep going, keep picturing those things. And then at some point she's like, "Look, I want you to picture riches raining down from the sky on you," sort of symbolizing you getting these things that you want. And so Mrballen did that, and he began picturing the gold and the silver falling from the sky, landing on him, and he's narrating what he's feeling and seeing, and at some point he was so fixated on this idea of riches coming from the sky that he swore he could literally feel the gold and silver actually hitting his body. And at that point, when he was actually feeling something, is when the ritual was done. A little over a year later, on September 12th, 1994, the famous shaman, Mona Fandey, glided her way through a crowd of photographers on a street just outside of Kuala Lumpur. Mona was dressed to the nines. She had red lipstick on, her hair was all styled up, she had beautiful clothes on, and as she maneuvered through the crowd, she sort of feigned like she didn't want the attention, but she totally did. So it would turn out the ritual that she had performed on Mrballen a year earlier had made Mrballen incredibly famous. And in turn, it had made Mona even more famous than she already was. And so the paparazzi, they were desperate to get a photo of her because of her unbelievable fame. And for Mona, even though she acted like what she really cared about was being a shaman and helping people achieve their dreams and to heal and gain in prosperity, even though that's what she would say, the truth was, ever since she had had that big hit, that pop music album that had launched her into the stratosphere, ever since then, she had been chasing fame. And now she had really nailed it. I mean, she was like an icon in Malaysia. And so, as she maneuvered past the paparazzi and everyone's clamoring to get her attention and to get her photo, she thought to herself, my plan has worked perfectly. Except, it's important to understand that, Mona wasn't really famous as much as she was infamous. And it really stemmed from that ritual she performed on Mrballen. Because what she did to Mrballen is she actually just ritualistically executed him. Except it would turn out Mrballen wasn't even her first victim. He was her 8th victim, at least as far as we know, and she just got caught after she killed Mrballen. When Mrballen was laying in that room and the ritual's going on and he's being told to picture all these, gold coins and silver bars raining down on him, well, while he was doing that, and critically, he had his eyes closed, Mona grabbed an axe, raised it up, and brought it down into the middle of his chest. And so this ritual murder was designed to lead to somebody getting more power and more fame, except that person was not really Mrballen, it was Mona. I mean, Mrballen did become extremely well known for being a victim of Mona, but it was Mona who suddenly was the talk of the entire country. I mean, she was all over the news, and she was beautiful. And so it's like this crazy dichotomy of this unbelievably attractive woman who's also a serial killer. I mean, this is the stuff that just makes the news over and over and over again, and Mona loved it. And so when Mona was walking past that crowd of paparazzi and they're all taking photos of her, that was actually her walking to her murder trial. Every day, she would basically treat that walk up the steps to her murder trial as like her personal red carpet. With all the paparazzi taking her photo, she'd dress up in these lavish outfits and smile for the cameras on her way to be tried for murder. And then ultimately, she was convicted of it and sentenced to death. But she was totally unfazed because for her, again, it was all about gaining this incredible notoriety, and she had succeeded. It was like the ultimate shaman move, and she had done it. On the day of Mona's actual execution, she was going to be hanged, along with her assistant and husband. They too were found guilty. On her walk to the gallows, we have all these reporters and all these photographers, and she's still flashing smiles and treating it again like it's her own personal movie premiere. I mean, she didn't care at all that she's literally about to be killed. And then literally her final words as the noose is being put around her neck were, "I'll never die." The next and final story of today's episode is called A Son's Nightmare. One evening in February of 2011, a man in his 30s named Yang was eating dinner inside of his home in a rural village in China. Around him at the table were his 5 elderly aunts, who he lived with and took care of. Now, nobody spoke over dinner. It was totally silent, but this was common, and it was not awkward at all, because Yang actually preferred silence. He had been born with a disability that made it nearly impossible for him to speak. It also had left him blind in one eye, and over the course of Yang's life, he had been sort of bullied for his disability. And as a result, he really didn't like being around other people, and he certainly didn't like trying to talk to other people. I mean, that was really, again, something he had a really hard time doing. But in his life, the few people that totally accepted him and loved him were his family, in particular his 5 aunts. They didn't care at all that basically he never spoke. And so, for example, at this dinner table, there was no expectation that anybody would speak, and Yang loved it. But more than just feeling happy that he could be himself around his aunts, Yang also took a lot of pride in looking after his aunts. He wanted to make sure they were comfortable and well looked after in their old age. So after this silent dinner, Yang stood up and he cleaned the table off, and then he helped one of his aunts go up to her bedroom. And after getting her tucked in, and as Yang was about to go down and help the next aunt go to her bedroom, he heard sirens outside. Now, Yang lives in this very remote rural village in China that's actually so remote they didn't have their own police force. But even more specifically, Yang literally in his whole life had never even heard a siren or seen a police car. And so this is like really unique. And so instead of going and helping his next aunt, Yang went outside to see what was going on. And as soon as he got out there, he looked down the hill. He was up on top of this hill. That's where his house was. He saw at the base of the hill, about 600 feet away, were 2 police cars with their lights flashing. I mean, clearly something major was happening in his town. And so again, feeling very curious because he's never seen anything like this, Yang decides to continue to investigate. And so he leaves his home and begins walking down the road towards the cars. But he stops at a safe distance away because 1, he doesn't want to interfere, and 2, he really doesn't want to talk to the police because he can't really talk. And he's actually worried that he's going to get bullied if he talks to the police. And so from a safe distance, he just stood there and watched whatever was going on. And what was going on is the 2 police officers who had responded and shown up in Yang's village were standing there at the foot of this hill trying to make sense of this insane story a local farmer had just told them. The man was sitting there, his face was in his hands, he was crying hysterically, and he was trying to give them more information, but it was like he was too upset. And finally, one of the officers tells the guy, hey, stop what you're doing, start all over again, calm down, and just tell us the story from the beginning. And at this, the farmer did calm down, and after taking a deep breath, he told the officer the story. He said about a week earlier, he had this horrible nightmare. He said he dreamed of his mother and she was shrouded in darkness and she was terrified and she was screaming for his help. And the farmer said, in the dream, he ran to his mother to try to save her. But as soon as he would get close to her, it was like this shadow went over his mother and then she disappeared. And then the farmer would wake up and he'd be so terrified and so upset. Now, at first, the farmer told the officer that, he didn't think much of this nightmare. He was not a superstitious person. He just thought, it's a nightmare. But over the next several days, he kept having the same nightmare about his mother that, she was scared and then she would disappear as soon as he went to help her. And so after a week of these horrible dreams, the farmer said he finally decided, I'm just going to go check on my mother in person and make sure she's okay. But when he went to his mother's place, his mother was missing and he couldn't find her anywhere. And he had this horrible thought that she'd been abducted. And so he had called the police. Now, the police did understand that it was totally bizarre that they were here ultimately because of some guy's nightmare, but when they went to his mother's place, she really was missing, and so they ultimately told the farmer to just go home and that they would put together a search party and they would look for his mother. And so after the farmer said okay and then headed back towards his place, the two officers got back in their cruisers and they drove out of the village past Yang, who was still standing there watching everything happening, back to the police station. And there, the officers immediately coordinated two investigative teams that would go out and look for the farmer's mother. Now, one of these teams was sent to a local city to basically canvass the area to see if she was there, but that search proved to be fruitless. And then the other investigative team, they were sent back to the village. And when they were there, they went door to door asking all the residents if they had any idea what happened to this farmer's mother. And it was during this search in the village that they got a tip. And that tip would lead them to a very specific location, Yang's home. And when police went to Yang's home, they found the front door was wide open. But when they walked right up and yelled inside of the home, calling out for Yang, nobody yelled back. In fact, the home was totally dark and silent. And so after a few more minutes of police calling out for anyone inside the home to come out and talk to them and not getting an answer, the police decided to walk inside. And so into this dark, cramped home they went. And as they walked, they noticed there were all these dirty towels and dirty dishes and sort of trash everywhere. I mean, the place was kind of a pigsty. And again, it's eerily silent. Every step they took, they were walking on these boards that creaked with every step. And as they're moving, they're calling out, Yang, if you're in here, come out. But again, it's totally silent. And they eventually make their way to the very back of the home. Now, the police really did not know what to expect when they showed up at Yang's place, but they did hope that by going there, they would somehow, some way find a reasonable explanation for all of this. The dream that kicked off this investigation and this totally bizarre tip they got. I mean, they really just wanted to put this thing to bed, and they were hoping that by going to Yang's place, they would get that. However, when the police walked into the very last room they had not searched yet, the very back of his home, they knew there was no reasonable explanation here. That back room is where Yang's aunts all slept. And when the police walked into that room, sure enough, the aunts were in their beds where Yang had left them. However, the police realized, wait a minute, we have been yelling and screaming and trying to get people to come out of the home, yet all these women are still asleep. How could they possibly sleep through all that commotion? But as the police walked up to each of these 5 women, they realized the outlandish tip that had sent them here in the first place had to be correct. It would turn out Yang did not harm that farmer's mother. In fact, he did the opposite. She was one of his 5 elderly aunts, and he went to great lengths to care for each of these women. I mean, he basically would have done anything for them. However, there was a problem. His 5 aunts were dead, and had been for a long time. While Yang considered these women to be his family, literally, he called them his aunts, in reality, he was not related to them at all. Instead, these were just women from the local village where he lived who had been nice to him. They had all died of natural causes. But Yang didn't understand it when they passed away. Instead, all Yang knew is that he was sort of an outcast and that nobody respected him and he was treated really badly by most people except for these women. They'd been the only people that really cared about him. And so after they died, he felt really sad and lonely. And so, one by one, he dug these women up and brought them home with him and began caring for them as if they were still alive. When that farmer had gone to go check on his mother after having the recurring nightmare about, her going missing, he had gone to her gravesite and found her coffin was literally empty, hence believing somebody had abducted her body. And then the strange tip police got that led them literally to Yang's house was a local had seen Yang carrying a body up the hill to his home. And his home actually was not a typical home. Instead, Yang's home was actually just a cave that he had outfitted with some boards on the ground for a floor and a couple of makeshift beds. Yang was arrested for what he did, but ultimately he was sent to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. All of the bodies that Yang stole were reburied, and the farmer's recurring nightmares about his mother stopped as soon as her body was returned to her grave.